History 1. My name is Tom, and I live in Australia. In the southeast of Australia lies the state of Victoria, and in that state lies the high country, an extremely vast and remote expanse of alpine mountains and valleys. It's a place largely only accessible by four-wheel drive and can take days to get in and out of. The area is popular with four-wheelers, deer hunters, and hikers. We four-wheel drive, and this was our chosen destination for a few days of camping away from the world, beyond the reach of mobile phones. This break was definitely needed. The four-wheel drive was loaded up, our list double-checked, and vehicle maintenance done. Fuel was loaded onto the roof racks, and the police station closest to our destination notified of our trip. It's common for people to notify them, a safety measure, especially when not traveling in a convoy. This is very remote country we were headed to, a place called Wangata Valley, a remote valley deep in the high country, an enormous amphitheater-type valley with alpine mountains rising high in every direction and a river running along the valley floor. Towards the end of the first full day of driving, we made our way down the last track for the day, skirting the ridge and arriving at the valley floor as the sun dipped below the mountains. We found a secluded spot to pitch our tent, nestled among the eucalyptus trees by the riverbank. It was midweek and off-season, so we were the only ones in the valley, at least that we knew of. After setting up camp and having a meal by the fire as the sun went down, we snuggled up together in our sleeping bags and decided to hit the hay. At some point during the night, I woke up to a loud noise. I wasn't really sure what I'd heard from inside our tent, so I continued to listen. Nothing. Must be going mad. No sooner had I thought that, I heard another noise. It sounded like something falling off our table hitting the ground. I put it down to possums or wombats, common in the area, so nothing to worry about. I should have packed up after dinner, I thought, and then went back to sleep. Sunrise came and we slowly woke up. Needing to pee, I opened up the tent and jumped out. Looking around, something just came over me, a chill. It wasn't the way we'd left it. Instead of seeing two chairs together by the fire where we were sitting, one of them was by the table, and on the table was a loaf of bread that I swore I packed away the night before. I walked over to the table to inspect it. A half-eaten piece of bread was just sitting there with a very obvious chomp mark taken out of it. I flung the tent open and asked, "Hey, were you up before me? Did you have some bread?" "No," was the answer I got. Sarah got up, and together we went through all of our stuff. Nothing was missing. But as we went to check our vehicle, I noticed footprints. There was a bunch of them around the front of the car where the hood was. Most of the camp was covered in grass, and this was the only spot that was just dirt. Had someone tried to open it? They were very distinct footprints, not mine or my partner's. Perhaps they'd already been there. These camping spots are used intermittently. Obviously, we weren't looking at the ground when we arrived the night before, especially with the setting sun. I don't think either of us wanted to admit what we were both thinking, that someone had been creeping around our campsite in the night, far from civilization. We discussed if a possum could have made those bite marks and argued about if one of us had left the bread out. Eventually, we discussed moving on and camping somewhere else. After much deliberation, we both decided to stay. I had the rifle in our vehicle, which I guess gave me an overinflated sense of safety, which in hindsight was a very poor choice. As the day rolled on, the sun shining and with nothing eventful happening, I decided to walk across the valley floor, about 800 meters to an old ruin of an isolated homestead built by settlers who ran cattle in the valley some 100 years ago. It's steeped in mystery. There's an old unsolved murder from 1917 that always captivates people. I read the plaque, took some photos, and started to wander back to our camp. As I neared the halfway mark back to camp, I noticed Sarah walking across the field toward me. Must have gotten bored, I thought. As she approached me, it was clear that she was in a panic. Immediately, she started to tell me how she went down to the riverbank to wash the pots and pans, and as she looked up, she saw someone on the other side of the river, watching her from deep in the bush. I had no reason whatsoever not to believe her. I asked what he looked like, and got told an old man, 70s thereabouts, scraggly looking and wearing old, tattered clothes. Apparently, the second she looked up, he turned and walked away. disappearing into the bush. I couldn't comprehend it. How the hell was anyone out here without a four-wheel drive or a dirt bike? And how would anyone get to that side of the bank without first crossing over from our side? There's days worth of nearly impossible to walk through bush on the other side just to get to where my partner saw him. We decided to jump back in the vehicle and drive along the length of the valley, checking the dozen or so riverside camping spots as we went. I wanted to spot a camp, have my partner ID the guy, make sure he wasn't creeping around. Our theory was that he might have been a hunter off in the bush after a deer or something. After making our way up and down the valley and not seeing anything else, we drove back to our camp, at a loss to explain anything. As the sun started to set, my partner and I, quite shaken up, grabbed the rifle and sat it next to us as we cooked dinner and chatted, having a few drinks to settle our nerves. Was it just that there's a lot of mystery surrounding the valley and homestead murders? We talked a bit and settled in, enjoying the warmth of the fire. At some point, Sarah needed to go to the toilet. I was asked to come with her to the spot behind a tree where we placed the portable toilet, maybe about 50 meters from camp. Considering everything that had gone on, it was a no-brainer. Sarah did her business, and we turned around to head back. That's when we saw him, standing at our camp, about a meter from the rifle I had sitting against the table. It was a man, old, scraggly looking, and wearing old, tattered clothes. Sarah squeezed my arm so hard I thought it was going to come off. Everything about her body language screamed this was the same man. As we got closer, I could make out more odd things about him. He had part of a deer antler in his hand that looked like he'd been whittling away at it, and what looked like antler pieces carved to plug where holes in his ears were. The same goes for the bone-looking buttons on his ratty old coat. He wore old leather shoes that looked homemade. "Good day, mate," he said. "Mate, you gave us a heart attack," I said, officially bricking it. "Where have you come from? Everything okay?" "Just over yonder. You lot aren't hunting around here, are you?" he asked, looking directly at my rifle. We might, yeah, why?" "There's no hunting around here, not enough deer as it is." "Well, we hadn't decided on it. Probably packing up anyway," I said as I edged my way toward the rifle. "Should put this away anyway. Didn't mean to spook you, mate." "It's all good. Guns don't spook me," he said. "I didn't imagine they would." I picked up the rifle by the barrel and held it like a walking stick, attempting to be non-confrontational, breathing a sigh of relief. "No offense, but you caught us a bit by surprise. You got to be the only one we've seen since we got here." "Yeah, I saw you come in last night." "I bet you did. Been coming up here for 40 years. Beautiful spot, isn't it? Takes a bit to get down the valley." "Yeah, mate. Look, no offense, but we're going to hit the sack soon. Do you need a lift back to your camp?" "No, all good. Just out for a wander before I tuck in for the night. Saw the fire and thought I'd say good day. Anyway, better be on my way." And with that, he turned and walked off, parallel to the river and into the dark with no torch. That was officially enough to spook us beyond any ability to calm down. We decided to pack up in the dark and head out, even if driving in the dark was monumentally stupid in this part of the high country. We got into the vehicle and drove out, taking us along the valley floor. We didn't see a single fire, camp, or vehicle. Nothing. We kept on driving. Halfway home, Sarah, bored from the drive, flipped on the camera. No memory card. After getting home and telling a few people what happened, a friend's dad, an avid bushman himself, was the one to officially freak us the hell out. "Oh, you met the button man." "The what now?" I said. "The button man. He's an old bushman who goes out into the high country for months at a time, hunts with a spear, appears out of nowhere, scares people, and has these buttons made out of bone. There's a heap of people gone missing up that way. Cops keep looking but can't find a single trace. Campers, hikers. One camp was found burnt to the ground and a car left abandoned. Can't find any evidence at all." A quick Google confirmed it all. The missing people, the button man, the lack of evidence. Police set out into the bush, found his camp, spoke with the man, but have nothing else to go on. We don't camp in that valley anymore. Hell, we don't camp on that side of the high country anymore at all. Anyway, that's our story of how we met the Button Man. History 2. My name is John, and I live in the heart of Texas. A few months back, I went on a weekend camping trip with a bunch of my buddies. This trip stood out because all the creepy stuff that happened seemed to focus directly on me. Both incidents involved what I thought was a member of our group, and both times, it had to do with my relentless need to always use the bathroom. The first encounter was in the middle of the night. Everyone was lounging around the campfire, enjoying the warmth, when I decided to make the quarter-mile trek to the campground bathrooms. There were other campers scattered in the area and the light of the moon overhead, so I didn't think twice about walking through the woodland. I came to a fork in the path, with the alternative route leading back into an unused campsite. In the dark, I could make out the rocky outline of the fire pit dead center in the clearing. The space was empty, but for some reason, I couldn't break my line of sight. Something dreadful was holding my attention. Then I saw it, the unmistakable shape of a person stepping out of the tree line. The thing about this person was, as they walked, they had a very peculiar gait. They maneuvered through the brush until they spilled out onto the trail just ahead of me. I was close enough to confirm my suspicions. This was a friend of mine from camp. His weird way of walking was a dead giveaway. Now that I could actually see him, there was no doubt in my mind. The issue was, he was wandering around the wrong camp and now seemed to be trying to lose me in the dark. What really confused me was how he managed to get ahead of me when he had such a hard time walking anyway. I chalked it all up to some kind of prank. I tried to get his attention, to which his only response was, "Stop following me." "I told you guys I was going to the bathroom," was my only response. "Why are you following me?" he whispered. It sounded more like a hiss in the dark. It was his voice, but it was in VJATEMT at the same time. I tried to catch up with him, but no matter how much I sped up, he stayed the same distance from me. This was all troubling because I can't stress this enough. My friend's legs and hips barely worked. I eventually lost him in the shadows just as I arrived at the toilets. I did my business, washed up, and then walked back to our camp without any incident. When I arrived, I found that same friend sitting in the same spot as when I left. Everyone claimed that he never left and I was alone the whole time. Again, I just accepted it as a prank among friends during that weekend outing. Fast forward to about 3 a.m. Everyone was fast asleep and the fire was long dead. Again, I needed to go to the bathroom. Since it was late and I only had to pee, I decided to forego the long trek to the bathrooms and just water a nearby tree. I stepped out into the darkness and found a place to do my business. As I was doing so, I heard another tent unzip and then rezip behind me. I knew it was one of my friends, so I didn't give it any other thought until I got back into the clearing. There he was again, that same friend I saw creeping around the other campsite. He was standing in a strange way, attempting to light a cigarette. I could see his face in the flint spark just behind his hands. His dark eyes stared at me in a way that I can't explain. Unblinking, unwavering. He didn't speak until after the cigarette caught and he took a puff. "Can you hear me?" he asked. I started to say yes, but I hesitated. Could I hear him? Certainly I saw the motions of his mouth, but the more I replayed what he just said to me, the more unclear it became. It was as if he spoke to me underwater, faint and distorted. I simply nodded. "Can you hear me?" he asked again, this time a little more clearly. "Yeah, man, what VJTM's up? Can you hear me?" When he asked this time, he was speaking so loudly that I couldn't VJTMT move, like some sort of audio shock. The best way to describe it was deafening. "Yeah, dude, are you trying to wake everybody up?" I asked him. He kind of shook his head and gave me a repulsive look, puffing on the cigarette. I watched as he turned and stumbled toward our parked vehicles, maybe 30 feet away. He started to turn around the back end of my car when I realized they were pulling a prank on me again. I charged after him around the car only to find myself alone. The parking lot was empty, save for the shadows of the trees. There was in VJTMT even a wisp of the cigarette Hev Gertly been smoking. Not even a hint. I returned to camp and found his tent zipped up, his boots unlaced before the door, and I could actually hear him snoring inside. I went to bed and decided not to mention it in the morning. If it was a prank like I thought, they'd DJTMD surely bring it up. No one ever did. History 3. My name is Mike, and back in the day, I went on a camping trip with my girlfriend Sarah. We decided to celebrate her birthday and our anniversary by going camping 5 hours away from home. We left town early the day after a big storm had passed through, so we got to the campground early in the afternoon. This gave us plenty of daylight to find the perfect spot and set up camp. The guy at the entrance mentioned that we were the only ones staying there, and Sarah was thrilled. "This is going to be amazing," she said, and I couldn't help but agree. We drove down long pathways to our designated area, and as we got closer, the road tapered into a dead end. This meant we VDJJTMD have to back out in reverse to leave. There was no quick way to get out of our campsite. We unloaded the car, set up the tent, and decided to explore the woods. It was dead silent, but the daylight made it feel safe, so we just soaked in all the nature. We walked a few miles and reached a part of the woods where we saw some weird-looking white cabins. They were very uniform, all built the same way, like they were part of the campground, but they seemed way out of the way with no sign of life. It felt eerie, like we shouldn't be there. The only way I can describe them is sterile, the opposite of what UVJTMDD expect at a campground. We turned around and walked back to our campsite, took a breather in the tent, and then tried to start a fire in the fire pit. Unfortunately, neither of us had ever been camping before and had no idea how to start an actual fire. We had bought some self-lighting logs from Walmart and some lighter fluid, but everything around us was soaked from the rain the day before. We knew we needed some kindling, but dry sticks or leaves were hard to find. It slowly dawned on me how unprepared we were. The reality of the fresh storm, the isolated wilderness, and the lack of real supplies had me on edge. Eventually, we got a small fire going, ate hot dogs and marshmallows, and spent some time looking at the stars. That's when we noticed how dark it was out there. Sarah, easily spooked, asked, "Can we get into the tent now?" So we put the fire out and crawled into our tent. We were talking to one another, but I could tell she was tense. Suddenly, she put her hand over my mouth and asked, "Shh, you hear that?" Before I could respond, we heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps. It sounded like a group of people walking. I whispered back, "It's probably just animals or something." Then we heard mumbling. Low, hushed mumbling. We couldn't make out words, but it didn't sound like animals. It sounded like words, but not clear ones. We sat in silence, staring at each other in the dark for what felt like forever. The mumbling got louder, as did the footsteps, until it sounded like it was right outside our tent. We both froze, barely breathing. I hoped it was a drunk camper stumbling around, but then I remembered the ranger saying we were alone this weekend. It briefly crossed my mind that it might be the ranger himself, as he was the only one who knew where our camp was. Then silence. We waited and waited, not sure how much time passed until Sarah said, "We have to get to your car." Adrenaline pumping, I peeked out of the tent into the darkness and told her to stay behind me. Then we ran to the car. I locked the doors and she said, "What the heck was that? We can't stay here. No one else is out here but us. What was that?" I looked around for any signs of life but saw nothing. I told her, "Okay, I'm going to grab our stuff. You stay in the car." We only had our ice chest in the tent. I hopped out, grabbed the ice chest, and tossed it into the back seat. As I turned to get the tent, I started hearing those footsteps again, closing in. In a moment of pure terror, I yanked the tent out of the ground, wrapped the tarp around it, and slung it over my shoulder like some panicked Santa Claus. I shoved it into the trunk and asked, "Do we have everything?" She said yes, and I floored it in reverse out of the camping area. When I say floored it, I mean I slowly backed down the trail at a snail's pace. There was no quick way to escape going backward in the dark. We came to a fork in the road that split into 6 different directions. I asked Sarah if she remembered which path we came down to get in here. She didn't know. We ended up choosing a random one and ended up in some other camping spot. I cursed under my breath and reversed again. Then I noticed the angle we exited from and could see the main path back to the gate. thanks to a small sign behind an overgrown bush. As we hightailed it out of there, I noticed a single small green light out in the woods near our designated spot. It reminded me of the fake logs we bought. The paper on the outside burned green when they first started to catch, just like the green glow I could see now. I had left those logs by the fire pit, and it seemed like someone was using them. We drove the entire 5 hours back to our hometown and fell asleep on Sarah VTM's parents' BJJTAM couch at around 4 a.m. We never talked about that trip for the rest of our relationship, and I haven't had any desire to go camping since. History 4. When I was in high school, me and my buddies decided to camp out in a really remote spot up in the Colorado mountains. Just getting there required a pretty serious off-roader, and it was about 30 miles up a rough road. There were river crossings, huge boulders in the road, and tons of sand pits. Isolated would be an understatement for this part of the world. The road took us all day, and all day we didn't VJTMT see a single other person. No one passed us, we didn't VJTMT see anyone camping, nothing. At this point, one of my friends, Jake, noted it looked like no one had driven on the road in a while. We found that odd because this was in Colorado, and roads and trails like this are usually popular for recreation. Something else worth pointing out is that this road led into a box canyon, which is basically nature VJTM's cul-de-sac. The road we were on was the only road in and the only road out. All around us were massive cliffs, and cell phone service was a good 25 miles away. With all that said, we eventually got to the spot and set up our camp. Every time we went camping, we played Capture the Flag, and this trip was no exception. We waited for it to get dark and then started the first round. In the middle of the second round, me and one of my teammates, Sam, hopped up on the road which ran parallel to the area we were playing in. It seemed like a good way to get around to the other flag. Walking down that road, we began to see a glow coming toward us. Our first thought was ITVJTAM's, another 4x4 coming into the canyon, but as it got closer, we realized that it was in VDJTM, a vehicle of any kind. It was a young woman holding up her phone, looking for service. She was still at a distance, but we could tell that she was panicking. She was rushing and stumbling at the same time, and she didn't VJTMT seem drunk. It was weird, so we called out to her, "Hello?" No response, but it wasn't VJTM that she ignored us. It was more like she didn't VJTMT even realize we were there, so we tried again. "Hey, are you okay?" Nothing. As she was passing us, we realized she was crying. Again, we asked, "Are you okay?" She stumbled right past us, never showing a single sign that she saw us. The whole time she was just looking at her phone for service. Sam and I were frozen, watching her go, still stumbling and still crying. She rounded a turn and then disappeared. I yelled out to everyone to meet us back at camp, and we did. I told them all what we saw, and I'm not proud to admit this, but we got creeped out. We decided we VDJTMDD stay in camp that night, and in the morning, we VDJTMD go looking for her. First thing in the morning, we decided there must be some other people camped down the road who might know her. So we went down to the end of the road. There was no sign of anyone. So then we decided to go to the entrance of the road and look for that woman again. We made the all-day drive back to the canyon entrance and didn't VDJTMT see a sign of anyone. I still feel guilty for not trying harder to help her, but thinking about how she got in that position, it just doesn't VJTMT out make sense. She didn't VDJTMT look like a hiker. She had on regular jeans and a sweater. If Chev DJTMD gotten into the canyon from the other side, it would require a very technical descent. She would have needed gear, and she didn't VJTMT even have a backpack. We were pretty sure we were the only ones that had driven down that road in a while, so ITVDJTM's not like someone just dropped her off and left her. And the whole time we saw her, she was holding up her phone looking for service. If she knew the area at all, she would know that there was no way she was going to find any. My friends and I never found her and still don't know what to make of it. We've DJTMV've gone back to camp on and off over the years, but that trip still stands out for every single one of us. History 5. Back in the summer of 1991, I went on an outdoor youth program called Wilderness Therapy. It was one of those programs where they take a bunch of troubled teens out into the wild to straighten them out. Our hike was 63 days through Tonto National Forest in Arizona. We were teenagers, many of us delinquents or troublemakers. This was an isolation program, so all our focus and energy went to daily survival. We ran into people only once during that entire 63-day trek, and it was early on. This was the most remote place I'd ever been at the time, with no civilization for at least 75 miles in every direction. During one part of the trip, our group was hiking through a canyon, using a river called Clear Creek to navigate the terrain. This area was extremely rugged, without any kind of trail system or campsites. The canyon was a slot canyon, meaning almost totally vertical slopes on either side, and the river itself was full of boulders and other treacherous obstacles. It was slow going during this portion of the trip. One day, as we're all moving through the canyon, a few of us spotted a suitcase up ahead. It was balanced atop a rock well above the water, as if it had been placed there. We fished it off the ledge and popped it open. Inside, we found women's dresses, wigs, shoes, and some cans of soda and non-perishable foods like stew and chili. We looked up and down the river, but there were no roads or paths for miles. The hiking guide suggested it might have fallen out of an airplane, but we inspected the outside and found it totally intact. It would have been pulverized if it had fallen thousands of feet into a bed of stone, but there wasn't a single blemish on it. Our next theory had to do with the river. Arizona has a season called monsoon, where it rains all over the state. We thought maybe a flood had picked up the suitcase from a camp upstream and brought it down to where we found it. But the suitcase was atop a rock well above our heads by 6 or 8 feet. It wasn't waterproof, and everything inside seemed undisturbed. There was no way it had been caught in a flood. We left the suitcase where we found it and chalked it up to a mystery. Who would bring wigs, dresses, and high heels in a suitcase to a place so remote? It definitely creeped us all out to no end. The part I think about the most are the cans. If the suitcase had been deposited there, maybe someone planned on disappearing that summer in '91, and that was one of their waypoints. It still creeps me out to this day. I often think about that mysterious suitcase and the story it might hold. Maybe someone was on the run, or perhaps it was something more sinister. We never did find out, and it's something that stays with me. All those dresses and wigs and the food. It makes you wonder what kind of person would haul all that into the wilderness. It's a story that my friends and I still talk about when we get together. Some mysteries just never get solved. History 6. When my buddy Jim and I graduated high school, we decided to hike the Grand Canyon. Being dumb 18-year-olds, we picked a trail based on its high difficulty rating. It was called the Tanner Trail, and from what I last read, the trail had been partially wiped out by a massive landslide. It was a beautiful but exhausting hike. We did this in late June, so the temperatures down in the bottom of the canyon were approaching 120 degrees. Like I said, it was a poorly planned hike by a couple of dumb high schoolers. The final approach to the Colorado River was along a dry creek bed, which we thought was Tanner Creek. We rounded a few boulders and approached the river. We hadn't seen a single human being the entire way, so we were totally relaxed as we hiked. When we reached the river, we walked up on a man that I can only describe as a stereotypical Native American man in his late 20s or early 30s. He had long black hair and a denim shirt tucked into his jeans, almost like Lou Diamond Phillips from Young Guns, if you've seen that movie. For a second, I actually thought he was a set extra. Just stumbling across this man at the bottom of a massive canyon on a totally empty trail was odd. Is there a film crew here somewhere? I wondered. As we walked toward him, he didn't notice or even acknowledge us, sort of spaced out. He looked up and we exchanged a nod of greeting. Then we saw what he was doing, throwing a racquetball into the rapids at the foot of the creek. The rapids carried the ball downstream for 6 or 8 feet before shooting it into a stone. The ball struck the stone with such force that it bounced out of the water, through the air, and landed back in the man's hand. It sounds like a parlor trick or maybe impossible, but as I watched him, I felt like I was watching magic. That's when I noticed his appearance, not his clothes, but his physicality. Like I said, we had to take a dry creek bed for several miles to reach the river. The whole canyon floor in the area was a dust pit, but this guy was miraculously clean, not a speck of dirt on him. The other factor was the lack of sweat VDJ, no beads, no stains, nothing VDJ. And it was well above 110 degrees. The situation was becoming more and more surreal. In our worn-out state, we just wanted to find somewhere to set up camp. So we said hi, said goodbye, and then walked upstream. He said hi and then walked downstream, and we never saw him again. It didn't occur to us until later to wonder how in the hell he knew he could do that little trick with the ball. Not just how he was doing it, but how did he know it would work? We didn't sleep well that night, but nothing more came of this encounter. Jim and I still talk about that strange man at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and to this day, I can't shake the feeling that we witnessed something otherworldly. ITVDJTMD is one of those memories that sticks with you. And even though we never got any answers, ITVDJTMM's a story that keeps coming up whenever we reminisce about our high school days. History 7. All right, here goes number 6. I had a strange paranormal encounter when I was camping with a few friends in Okanagan Falls, British Columbia. We were camping to celebrate my 13th birthday. The girls and I had walked down to the lake for a swim. On the walk back to our campground, we walked along the river that had a fair-sized dam. Unfortunately, there had been an incident where 2 brothers drowned after being unable to escape the turbines a few years earlier. The dam was marked with a skull and crossbones and large signs saying, "Danger." After swimming and splashing around for a bit, we decided to call it a day and head back. I needed to use the bathroom, so my friends waited at the base of the path while I walked up to the toilets. Just as I started to enter the building, a figure stepped out of the opposite doorway. It was a boy in swim trunks, still dripping from his swim. He stood totally rigid, without any expression on his face. I opened my mouth to say hello, and the second I did, he strolled right by me, heading back toward the lake. I just shrugged and went about my business. When I reunited with my friends, I asked if they saw the other boy come by, and they said they didn't see anyone. We listened for a moment to see if we could hear him, but all we found was silence. We were a couple of 100 meters down the river and close to our campground when I saw an incredibly clear and bright white figure of a portly preteen boy walking atop the water. I stopped and told my friends to look, and one of them did, exclaiming she saw him too. The other covered her face and said she was too scared to look. We watched him for a few minutes until he faded away. He walked along the river's surface slowly for about 10 meters and then disappeared. He didn't disappear into the trees, though. To me, it looked like he slipped right through the surface of the water. It wasn't VDJTM at the same boy I saw at the bathrooms, but he did look similar. Similar enough that they could be brothers. ITVDJTM's still the most incredible supernatural encounter IVJTM've ever had. Looking back, I can't help but wonder if those boys were the ones who drowned near the dam. The way they appeared and then vanished was so eerie and surreal. It felt like they were trying to communicate something, or perhaps just reliving their final moments. It's a memory that has stayed with me, and even though it gave me chills, it's a story I find myself sharing whenever the topic of the paranormal comes up. History 8. In my younger days, I was a wildland firefighter in the Southwest. One season I was working deep in the backcountry of rural New Mexico. That part of the forest was big for recreation, but the southern end where we were stationed was beyond remote. Few roads and no campgrounds meant if you wanted to explore, you had to work for it. There was barely any tree coverage from the scorching afternoon sun out there. Our fire crew had 2 duty stations. One was in town, and the other was 2.5 hours up a winding, treacherous mountain road. The outlying station actually had a nice setup: a fire response building, an old forest ranger station, and a new double-wide trailer for us to crash in. This was over 20 years ago, so cell service wasn't possible out there. This forced the various fire teams to come up with different activities to keep us busy. We had a nice television setup inside for movie nights and horseshoes and other games outside around the fire pit. It was fun and cozy if you had the right team out there. I'll keep my story simple as it goes hand in hand with other stories from my captain. It was the night of July 4th. We weren't on a fire, but with the holiday, we really didn't know what to expect. We were tossing horseshoes and playing music, just generally having a good time. We had a physical training hike early the next morning, so there was no beer or alcohol of any kind. This meant everyone was turning in early. I had my own small room in the trailer and had one of the only windows in the joint. It faced away from the station, overlooking the wilderness. As I began to doze off, a voice sounded outside my window. It was one of my co-workers, one of the last I saw still awake. I stirred myself awake to hear him asking me to come outside, over and over again. I was laying on my side facing the window, so I looked up at the glass. I couldn't see him because it was still so dark, but also because the land kind of drops off on that side of the trailer. Still, I could hear his voice and just feel his presence outside. "Get out here, man," he encouraged. I didn't respond and instead just closed my eyes. "Hey, come out here real quick. You gotta see this. Can you come out here?" "No," I finally answered. His voice changed after I spoke. It was faster, deeper, agitated. I could feel the anger seeping through the wall. Somehow I knew if I opened up my eyes, I would see a hand in the window, beckoning me outside. The hand would be dropping down from above, not arching up from below. I got the feeling that whatever was pretending to be my coworker was incredibly tall, and that's why I couldn't see it. It started swearing at me, making me sweat. I lay frozen for what felt like an hour or two as it continued to bark at me in that voice. I eventually fell asleep from fatigue. I brought this up to the crew the following morning, as I transparently could. Everyone assured me they all went to bed shortly after I did, and no one was wandering outside the trailer. No one else heard or saw anything. We dismissed it as sleep paralysis. Only after we returned, my captain took me aside and told me his own weird story. Again, he assured me that he had never been outside my window. He went on to explain that a couple of months prior, he had been cowboy camping a couple of miles from the fire station. This means no tent and limited supplies. He and several others were watching for lightning fires in that area. One night, as he was laying in his bedroll, a heavy drop of mucus landed on his face. He assumed that it was sap or owl poop, did his best to clean himself off, but it dripped on his face and his head for the whole night. He shined his flashlight and even screamed to scare whatever it was away. He moved his bedding to a clearing away from the tree line, and it still dripped on him somehow. He waited for dawn, broke camp, and made for the station, and never told another soul. What was interesting was, I'd actually noticed that he had stopped taking outdoor overnight duties a few weeks prior. Our captain was usually the first to volunteer for weird solo jobs like that. He didn't really camp at all after he told me that story. We don't know what happened to either of us, but at the time we felt like they were related somehow. History 9. I always enjoyed taking solo camping trips. It was an easy way for me to relax and chill. Yesterday morning, I went up into the hills and set up my tent in a campsite near a well-known mountain range close to my home. With no Christmas plans, I figured camping would be better than just sitting at home. I also thought it would be a great time because I assumed there would be few people at the site. I was correct and surprised to find I was the only person there. Everything was going perfectly, and I was enjoying myself. After a long hike earlier that day, I decided to call it an early night since it had worn me out. Around 8 p.m., I cleaned up everything and got inside my tent to wind down. I passed out quickly, but around 3:15 a.m., I woke up to the sound of my tent zipper slowly being undone. I'm a light sleeper on these trips because I stay on guard, being alone. I also place my head by the entrance of the tent for this very reason. As I woke up, I immediately realized someone was trying to come into my tent. I have a handgun that I bring for protection, though I've never fired it outside of the shooting range. Never had I been in a situation where I needed to use it, so my adrenaline shot up. I slowly grabbed my handgun, pointed it toward the entrance, and decided to announce myself. I yelled, "I have a gun, and I will shoot you in 5 seconds if you don't leave right now." There was silence for about 3 seconds before I heard someone start running off. I kept my handgun aimed at the entrance for about 10 minutes, waiting for any sound of movement. Hearing nothing, I grabbed my phone and called the police. They told me they were about 20 minutes away, so I sat there in defensive mode, waiting. When the cops arrived, I came out of the tent and announced that I was the caller. I gave them my story, and they decided to look around the area. Not even 15 feet away, they found some guy trying to hide in a tree. It turned out he had taken mushrooms at another campsite nearby on one of the mountainsides and had gotten lost. He thought my tent was his. He was younger, maybe in his early 20s, and I could tell he was pretty shaken up. They arrested him, and as they were putting him in the back of the car, he yelled to me, "Man, I'm sorry about that. That was my bad." The cops asked if I wanted to press charges, but I told them not to worry about it. I was pretty angry, but even if this guy was lying about thinking it was his tent, I knew he was harmless. It was just some dumb guy who was high. Regardless, I packed up all my stuff and left the campsite. There was no way I was going to fall asleep after something like that.